The German soldiers laughed at first. Through drifting smoke and shattered trees, they saw figures running toward them. Smaller frames, lighter voices carried by the wind. Someone muttered a joke. Someone else lowered his rifle. Women. Against tanks. It looked like a mistake. Until the laughter died in their throats and the ground began to burn. If you enjoy deeply human war stories like this, consider subscribing. By 1942, the Eastern Front was no longer a campaign. It was a grinding, merciless collapse of assumptions. Hitler's promise of a swift victory in the Soviet Union had frozen and bled into something else entirely. German units that once advanced with confidence were now dug into defensive lines, exhausted, underfed, and haunted by the scale of the resistance they faced. And still, many of them clung to one belief, that the enemy was inferior, poorly trained, desperate, crude. That belief extended to Soviet women in uniform, to the German command, and to many ordinary soldiers. Female combat units were dismissed as propaganda theater, a sign that the Red Army was running out of men. Posters and rumors spoke of women's battalions, and the reaction was often ridicule. War, after all, was a man's business. At least, that's what they told themselves. What they didn't see was the desperation inside the Soviet Union. Entire cities erased, families starved, millions dead or captured. For the Kremlin, survival demanded something radical. Women were no longer confined to factories and field hospitals. They were trained to shoot, to stalk, to kill. Not symbolically, practically. Young women students, farm workers, musicians were pulled into accelerated training programs. Some learned to become snipers, drilled to wait motionless for hours, breathing through frozen lips. Others were assigned to anti-tank units, taught to crawl under advancing armor with explosives pressed to their chests. There was no illusion about survival rates. They were told plainly, this is frontline warfare. Most of you will not come back. And still, they volunteered. By the time German armor began probing Soviet defensive lines during desperate counteroffensives, these women were already there, mud-stained, silent, disciplined. Their commanders knew the truth, even if the enemy didn't. These units weren't meant to inspire morale. They were meant to stop tanks. As German panzers rolled forward, steel beasts grinding the earth infantry followed behind, confident that resistance would break. When scouts reported women ahead, some officers waved it off. Others failed to adjust tactics at all. It was a fatal underestimation, rooted not in strategy, but in arrogance. The women waited until the tanks were close. Too close. They moved low and fast, slipping through shell craters and shattered trenches. Anti-tank rifles cracked the air, aiming not for the hull, but for tracks, vision slits, weak seams engineers had warned about, but commanders ignored. Molotov cocktails arced through smoke, bursting into flame as they struck hot steel. Fire poured into engine vents. Crews screamed inside sealed metal coffins. German infantry hesitated. Training hadn't prepared them for this image, women charging forward through gunfire. Faces set, movements precise, not panicked, not emotional, just focused. The hesitation lasted seconds. That was enough. Moments like this changed history, hit like so. This story reaches more people. In several engagements, German assaults stalled entirely. Tanks disabled not by heavy artillery, but by individuals willing to get close enough to die. Some of the women did, many of them, but they held the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive, for counter barrages to fall, for momentum to shatter. Inside German units, disbelief spread. Reports filtered back describing fanatical female soldiers fighting with unnatural resolve. The language tried to make sense of what they'd seen but couldn't. Commanders quietly revised expectations. Quietly, because admitting the truth meant admitting a deeper failure. The turning point wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. German soldiers had been told who the enemy was: weak, backward, inferior. Now that story collapsed under fire. If women trained, disciplined, relentless, were willing to die to stop a tank, what did that say about the war they were fighting? What did it say about victory? For the women themselves, there was no triumph in the moment, only survival. Those who lived dragged wounded comrades back through mud and smoke. Some collapsed where they stood, hands burned, ears ringing, uniforms soaked in blood that wasn't all theirs. There were no cameras waiting, no applause, just another night on the line. In the aftermath, German offensives slowed. Caution replaced confidence. The Red Army learned something crucial as well. These units worked not as symbols, but as soldiers. Women continued to serve in combat roles for the rest of the war, often suffering quietly, rarely celebrated, frequently erased from post-war narratives. The cost was immense. Thousands never returned. Many who did carried scars no parade would ever acknowledge, but their impact was undeniable. They shattered myths about gender, about weakness, about who could endure modern warfare. And for the German soldiers who laughed that first time, they never laughed again. Share this story with someone who thinks World War II outcomes were inevitable. The silence after those battles lingered longer than the smoke. German after-action reports began to change tone. The language grew colder, more careful. References to female units disappeared, replaced by neutral phrases: enemy infantry, anti-tank detachments, sniper elements. It was a quiet admission that something fundamental had gone wrong in their assumptions. The war on the Eastern Front was no longer just a contest of machines and numbers. It was a collision of wills. For the Soviet women who survived those early encounters, there was no sense of having made history, only the next assignment, another frozen position, another night without sleep. Many were rotated into different sectors, often without warning, because their presence unsettled the enemy. German units that learned women were in the area advanced more cautiously, sometimes slower than command demanded. Fear had found a new shape, yet behind Soviet lines, the reality was harsher than the propaganda posters suggested. These women lived under relentless scrutiny. If they faltered, it confirmed every doubt their critics held. If they succeeded, it was explained away as fanaticism or desperation. There was no room for error, only endurance. Letters home, when they could be written, rarely described the fighting. Instead, they spoke of cold hands that wouldn't stop shaking, of boots worn through to bare skin, of friends who vanished between roll calls. Many hid their injuries, terrified of being reassigned or dismissed as unfit. To be sent away from the front, to them, meant their sacrifices had meant nothing. German command failures compounded the situation. Intelligence officers repeatedly warned that Soviet defensive tactics were evolving, that enemy morale had hardened, not broken. These warnings were often ignored. Leadership clung to outdated beliefs about superiority, about who the enemy was supposed to be. Each misjudgment added to the cost. In one sector after another, small Soviet units, sometimes mixed, sometimes entirely female, delayed armored thrusts long enough to force operational pauses. Those pauses mattered. They allowed reserves to regroup. They bought time for factories far east of the front to produce more tanks, more guns, more ammunition. Time on the Eastern Front was everything, and still the fighting went on. As the war dragged into its later years, the women who had once been mocked became veterans. Some were barely 20. Their faces aged quickly, lined by exhaustion rather than time. They trained replacements, now young girls who arrived wide-eyed and left hardened in weeks. The lessons were blunt. Don't hesitate. Don't assume mercy. Don't believe the enemy's myths about you. Those myths can get you killed. When the Red Army finally began its massive westward push, these women were still there. Fewer in number, often overlooked, but present. They crossed rivers under fire, cleared villages room by room, and watched cities burn from the inside out. Victory, when it came, felt distant and unreal. After the war, history simplified everything. Parades rolled through Moscow. Medals were handed out. The story of triumph demanded clean lines and heroic silhouettes. Many women were told, directly or indirectly, to step aside, to return to normal life, to stop talking about what they had done. Their uniforms went into closets. Their experiences faded into family whispers, if they were spoken of at all. But the men who had faced them never forgot. In private memoirs, in quiet conversations years later, German veterans recalled the shock not of defeat, but of realization that the enemy they had dismissed was willing to fight with absolute commitment, regardless of gender, regardless of cost, that the war they believed they understood had revealed something far more disturbing, the collapse of every certainty they carried east. History often frames World War II as an inevitable march toward a known ending, but inevitability is a comfort invented after the fact. On the ground, nothing felt certain. Every decision mattered, every assumption carried consequences, and sometimes those consequences came charging forward through smoke and fire, refusing to match the story you told yourself about how the world worked. Decades later, historians would argue over numbers. over how many women served, how many fought directly, how many tanks were destroyed, how many shots fired, how many medals earned. Those debates miss the point. The true impact of these women cannot be reduced to statistics. Their presence rewired the psychology of the Eastern Front. For the German army, already strained by distance, weather, and attrition, the collapse of moral superiority was devastating. The belief that they were facing a lesser opponent had justified risk, speed, and brutality. When that belief shattered, hesitation crept in, and hesitation, in mechanized warfare, is lethal. For the Soviet Union, the lesson cut both ways. These women proved indispensable, yet their service exposed how desperate the situation truly was. A state willing to send its daughters crawling beneath tanks was a state fighting for its existence. There was no turning back from that reality. Many of the women carried that knowledge into peacetime. Some became teachers, engineers, doctors. Some never spoke of the war again. Others tried and were gently silenced. Post-war society wanted symbols of renewal, not reminders of how close everything came to annihilation. But memory has a way of resurfacing. In old age, a few survivors finally told their stories, not with pride but with clarity. They spoke of fear so constant it became normal, of moments when instinct replaced thought, of seeing German soldiers hesitate, not because of mercy, but because the world no longer made sense to them. They remember that first encounter especially well. The laughter, the disbelief, the brief, fatal pause before everything changed. History often celebrates generals, tanks, and grand strategies, but wars are decided in moments like that, moments shaped by human psychology, by arrogance meeting resolve, by leaders who fail to imagine what their enemy is capable of becoming. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers learned that lesson too late. They discovered that underestimating people because of gender, culture, or ideology can be as dangerous as underestimating a weapon. Those women were not anomalies. They were not propaganda fantasies. They were soldiers forged by necessity, discipline, and loss. And when they charged into the path of Nazi tanks, they carried more than explosives or rifles. They carried the collapse of a myth that said some people don't belong on the battlefield, a myth that said courage has a single face, a myth that said victory was already decided, and once that myth was destroyed, nothing on the Eastern Front was ever the same again.